Okay, so last week I wanted to make sure to give some kind of a sense of context of how we have, just an overview of uh, this the nature of the age that we are in. Well, if we're still in the Philadelphian age, and as many other things were in the Laodicean age, and as I always say, it's always easier to analyze prophecy when it's in the past, okay, not in the future. So the further back you go, the more you can see the patterns and how they emerge and things like that. But nonetheless, the character of the age, I wanted to do to just give an overview for how we have liberalism today. One of the guys mentioned this morning that he was talking to one of his friends and going back and forth, and the guy was, challenging on some things, and Tony was wanting to hold his own, and I'm not. Hang on. So anyhow, he was talking about how this friend, his pastor, was homosexual, and that this is where he got some of his thinking from, and so he was challenging some stuff like that. How do you get into that? How does that happen? And so that was the what we were talking about last week with the overview, going back from, and in fact. The next day, I saw Brian over on the street, and I was asking him how he was taking everything he liked and everything, but it was kind of complicated. So I went over it in like 30 seconds, how to look at it. Let me see if I can repeat it for our general understanding. That you had the Renaissance, in which you had. Let me get my initial starting point. Okay, you had disputes between the Eastern and Western churches, and then in 1054, the Eastern Church separated from the Western Church, the Orthodox Church from the Roman Church. And when you get up to the time of the Crusades, that because the Westerners had sacked Constantinople, now the Constantinople was not really working with the Western Church anymore, and so they fell prey to the Muslims, which started their scholars moving to the West, bringing the Greek scriptures with them. This starts off the Renaissance. Now people are learning about these original documents, and they're hearkening to them. This, in turn, provides for the Reformation and the Enlightenment. So the Renaissance led to the Enlightenment, which is the Age of Reason, but that the Age of Reason had a different effect in three different areas, geographical areas. The Enlightenment would cause the places like Germany to have a revolution within the church as they were talking about doctrine. The French Revolution had a war against the church because the state church was still there in France, and so the Age of Enlightenment turned on the church and tried to get rid of it in France. But in America, the revolution was for the freedom of the church. Over in Germany, because things were more subdued than in France, and they'd already had their revolution theologically within the church, they ended up with some stagnant creedalism, and this would lead to the pietistic movement, which was more experience-oriented. And then people reacted against that, and they wanted to have something more intellectual, which gave us German rationalism. And this German rationalism led to a lot of skepticism. And that is what gave rise to liberalism, was skepticism of the Bible, skepticism of doctrine. Their leaders, their theological leaders, were imported into America in places like Yale and Union Theological Seminary and other major colleges. And so the German rationalism gave liberalism to those areas of churches. So that's how you get all the liberalism that you have today, was from that German rationalism. The test is at the end of the class. Let's see how you can do on it. Okay. It'll be multiple choice. It'll be multiple choice. Okay. So I'm going to go over to page 236. I'm going to look at the charismatic movement, then we're going to look at dispensationalism after that. So the charismatic movement, we have the notes about this. Basically, it says on paragraph 678, while we are not covering the broader developments within Protestantism and other church movements, it's important to understand the historical lineage of the charismatic movement due to its significance in contemporary church history. There are going to be some other movements we're not going to pay attention to in church history. We're going to be looking pretty much at the ones that influence us. But the charismatic movement is something that we have to contend with regularly because it's very popular. I'm not going to say that these people are not Christians, but the speaking in tongues things comes along. And understanding the tongues can be seen on page 84. You can go back to that and look at that. In this context, Methodists had distanced themselves from their Anglican origins. And I was seeing some videos recently that the Anglican Church is going to have another split. One of John Wesley's teachings centered on the idea of sanctification, whereby individuals could progress to a state of being beyond temptation, and they referred to this as entire sanctification. And this is paragraph 678. And so this is a common problem all throughout church history. People get saved, and then they don't necessarily live for God. And so you have this question, well, what do we do about this? How do we look at this? One group, the Calvinists, said, well, you've got to really be persevering in the faith and having good works to prove that you're saved. And so even though the Calvinists believe in eternal security, they end up with a certain kind of works-based mentality, saying that I've got to keep performing. They focus on their work so much because they got to keep proving to themselves that they're saved. And this is what it really amounts to. And R.C. Sproul, who is famous as a Calvinist and really like a lot of his teachings, except when it comes to Calvinism, at the end of his life, he had some questions about this himself. And because, am I persevering? Am I doing everything that I should do? Or am I a faker? And so it really strikes at all kinds of people like that because they become so works motivated. Then you have the Catholic Church, which had the same issue essentially. What do we do with all this sin after people are professing Christians? And so their answer was to have works to compensate for their sin. Amongst other groups, you have this idea of entire sanctification, that you could get to the point where you are no longer sinning. Of course, Wesley never thought that he achieved that himself, but the later people in the holiness movement, which we're talking about here right now in the charismatic movement, they thought that they had achieved that. And you can see the holiness people, in fact, some of the people that we refer to as Pentecostals do not like to be called Pentecostals because I'm using a more generic sense of the term. They're more aware of a specific use of the term Pentecostal. Out of Wesley, you had the holiness movement, which was, again, thinking that they could get beyond temptation and they would be very austere, very dour people, no makeup, no pants on women, why is it always associated with the women? They're the ones that got to keep all the rules. But then they can become very legalistic as well. So So a strange thing that happened that turned it from being holiness to Pentecostal holiness. Paragraph 679. In the later holiness movement, which emerged during the early 19th century, there was a belief that some individuals had indeed attained this level of sanctification, and this belief laid the groundwork for what would become the Pentecostal holiness movement, as it was perceived as a second blessing or a second work of grace from the Holy Spirit. The origins of the charismatic movement can be traced to the Azusa Street revival in Los Angeles, California, around 1906. It was within this revival that the charismatic movement, recognized in 1906, movement began associating this second blessing with a manifestation of speaking in tongues. So now you've got not just holiness, but you've got the Pentecostal experience, which they say is marked by speaking in tongues. So it went from having the second blessing so that you could be beyond temptation, and is now called the second blessing as manifested with speaking in tongues. So the Pentecostal holiness movement was still very much holiness-oriented. Later on, as things evolved, pardon my French, the idea of the holiness sort of dropped off and the speaking in tongues stayed on. So that's why if I refer to somebody who's in a charismatic church, if I say Pentecostal, they say, oh no, we're not Pentecostals. Okay, yeah. By my standard, they are, which is a general standard of you're trying to speak in tongues like they had at Pentecost. By their standard, they're thinking of the denomination of Pentecostal holiness. Miss Nancy.
I guess I have two questions. I had a coworker who would object strenuously if I referred to her as a Pentecostal, even though she did go to a Pentecostal church. It was an Assemblies type church. I kept wondering, why does she take offense to this?
Yeah.
I never understood that. Do you have any idea why they don't want to be called Pentecostals?
Because they look at it as a denominational title that they don't utilize.
Well, okay.
They say we're not like the Pentecostal holinesses. We are.
Oh, so okay. So they think that those people are like too legalistic.
Yeah.
Okay. And another question I have: even if you allow for the speaking of tongues, where did they ever get the idea that once they did that, they would then be beyond temptation?
Oh, no. They just converted it over to that. It is no longer about being beyond temptation. It carries the same title of second blessing. They redefine the word second blessing. The old definition was entire sanctification.
But where does anybody, I know Michael Pearl believes that, where does anybody get the idea that they can no longer sin or that they're beyond temptation? Like, they just come up with this out of nowhere.
Okay. I have actually that altered view of it. I would say that, yes, we are beyond temptation in the Spirit, according to 1 John chapter 3, that somebody who's born again cannot sin because his seed remains in him, and he cannot sin because he's born of God. So we do not sin, we cannot sin. In our spirit. And then I'll point out, and this is the way I deal with this issue of people sinning after salvation. In your spirit, the new man is there with God, and you have the flesh, so that I still sin with the soul and the body. And so this is how I formulate the issue. So yeah, in the spirit, I'm all one with God because I'm transformed. I'm a new creature in my spirit.
And
in the
so
Rapture, I'll be transformed the rest of the way.
How do they say, with my body, I can no longer sin?
They don't. They just think that they got this second blessing so that they're just sort of beyond temptation in every which way. Okay. Yeah, so again, it's a definitional issue. Okay. Yeah, they just think that by grace, they got transformed some more, and then in that second transformation, they reached a new spiritual level of not being tempted at all anymore. Okay, so yeah, they don't account for the fact that even they still sin. Okay, and like I said, Wesley never claimed to arrive at that. He he postulated this idea, never claimed to arrive at it. Would be later on in the movement that would do. So it was Methodism to holiness, to Pentecostal holiness, and then from there to the charismatic churches today. Okay, so we've hit on liberalism, the charismatic churches. I'm going to look at dispensations next in a moment. Brother Tom.
Yeah. How do they deal with Romans 7 verses 14 to the soliloquy of
Yeah,
Paul?
well, that works with me, because I can say, yeah, with the flesh, and the sin is in my members, it's in my body. I'm waiting for the deliverance from this body. Oh, wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? So then, with I find a law within me. Then that with the mind I serve the law of God, and with the flesh the law of sin. Yeah, they don't deal with that. Yeah. Well, no, actually, I shouldn't say that. I don't know how they deal with that. I have not read what their commentators say about that. Okay. Yeah, raptured. Yeah. Okay. Dispensationalism. I'm going to go over this section. It's going to take me a little bit of a while to do this. I'm going to go through it as quickly as I can. This dispensational becomes a very important factor because it's the antithesis of covenant theology. In covenant theology, there are churches that think that they are just carrying over the covenants that were made to Israel, and that now they are being applied to the church, so that Israel is replaced by the church, and they call it replacement theology, where Israel goes away. And so, because of this becomes part of their rationale for having infant baptism, saying, well, they had circumcision in the Old Testament, and that was a covenant, so because we're carrying covenants forward, let's see if we can find a covenant basis for baptism. And so they say it was for children before, it's for children now. For infants before, now it's for infants now. When really all of that reasoning comes from the way paganism introduced infant baptism into the early church, and what they were doing as by way of the Protestant Reformation, they were coming out of the Catholic Church. In certain ways, they did. This is one of the things that they retained, was infant baptism. So infant baptism corresponding to circumcision seemed a very logical fit. Okay, I will say that circumcision does serve as a type. Circumcision was for the flesh. Okay, baptism is not for the flesh. Baptism is for the spirit. So once you get saved, you're eligible for baptism because of the new birth. Circumcision for the old birth, baptism for the new birth. And so there's no covenant relationship there. It's just simply we are in a new time period, and that is the key to all of this. I was talking to a professor out in Indiana when we were visiting one of the Bible colleges out there that was around Bonnie and Tim. And they, in their formulation, they looked at the opposite of Calvinism was dispensationalism. That's the first way I ever heard that association like that. And I thought, yeah, that would be right. That would be right. There is a logical antithesis to Calvinism. So dispensationalism becomes a very important point. Now, if you read the one book that's like classic is Charles Ryrie it's called Dispensationalism. So that should be easy to remember. We have it here in the library, I believe, behind me, and most of the bulk of the book deals with explaining the dispensations and other thoughts. But in the front part of the book, it explains the history of it. That really those people who say they're not dispensationalists, they actually are dispensational. They recognize at least the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, that you have a new way of God working in the church. And then they will possibly recognize 2 or 3 dispensations. But when you really develop this dispensational framework, you get to where you see about 7 dispensations. Now, the reason why 7, is it because God says there are 7? No. Okay. There are dispensations referred to in the Bible. The word dispensations is referred to in the Bible, the way God manages things and in his economy of things. But 7 seems to be a pretty good number when you start to look at the various ones. Only 1 or 2 makes me think a second time about it, but I think 7 is a really pretty good number. And in paragraph 681, it says, if you've been around churches very long, you know that although the return of Jesus Christ in the end times is not as theologically significant as the doctrine of salvation, the doctrine of salvation is going to be more important than the end times. The end times is probably the second most passionate issue that you'll find in churches. So the events surrounding the return of the Christ and the theology of last things are so exciting. However, the teaching of the end times has to be considered in the context of God's overall plan. So there is an overall plan. The end times is part of that overall plan. The doctrines of the end times represent the ultimate vindication of God's righteousness. Now, typically I will refer to things like this about why does God take so long to get to the end times? And I will typically refer to God proving himself in the course of history. One of the questions I've been asked lately is, why is it so complicated? It is complicated because, it's not so complicated as much as it is sophisticated. God weaves all these themes and so many things together in the Bible that man can't do. If God had given a simple set of instructions and said, here's my little rule book, and it was about this thin, it would look contrived as if man made it up. But God has everything recorded in such a way that man couldn't do it. All the ins and outs. It reminds me of Jesus Christ when he's on the road to Emmaus there with the disciples. Road to Emmaus with the disciples. And how that he opened up their eyes and showed them, beginning at Moses and all the way through, and he complained that they were so slow to receive the scriptures, and this was the case. As you look from Moses on, you can see all these things that are pointing to Christ. They couldn't have had any idea that they were doing this back at the time, and in fact, and this is my belief also, is that the Bible is about Jesus Christ. Okay, it's about his plan of salvation, but the whole book is about Jesus, which is why he is called the Word over in the Gospel of John, chapter 1. So that you're looking at Jesus Christ. So not only every type and then the fulfillment of that type, not only the prophecies, but every word is somehow referring to Jesus Christ. Every rock, every mountain name, everything points to Jesus Christ. So this is why there's so much, and I'm not going to say complexity, I'm going to say again, sophistication with how God weaves this all together so that it can be demonstrated that he has done absolutely everything that could be done in order to provide for our salvation. Okay. All through history, mankind has rejected God, but it did not stop God from revealing more of his plan of the ages. So Romans 3, verses 3 to 4 says, "For what if some did not believe? Shall their unbelief make the faith of God without effect? God forbid. Yea, let God be true, but every man a liar, as it is written, that thou mightest be justified in thy sayings, and mightest overcome when thou art judged." If people want to try to judge God, he's got such a case, such a big court case, and lots of depositions from all the saints from all over the ages to demonstrate that, yes, he has done everything. So paragraph 682, the end times are the ultimate vindication. God has presented his plan each step of the way through history. Mankind rejected his plan each step of the way. And by the way, this paragraph 682 is a real good, concise description of dispensations and how they work. Mankind rejected his plan each step of the way, and God will say in the end, I told you so. No, he'll say, I told you what I was going to do. Now there, I did it. You built your world on lies, fabrication, and assumptions, and none of you can maintain and fulfill your version of righteousness. Even though people reject the sovereignty of God because they want to be sovereign in their own life, even though they choose to not believe, even though they refuse to examine truth, God will be vindicated. He'll be justified in all that he has said. Ultimately, it will be said that he tried to tell us, but we would not listen. So you start in Genesis with the creation and work your way through the Bible with the fall and redemption, and end up in the Revelation with the restoration. So you got the fall, the redemption, and the restoration, all through the Bible. Along the way, God has worked with man through distinctive periods in history that form the framework through which God relates to mankind. Now you can start the rest of this paragraph here. We call these ages dispensations because they identify how God dispensed or administered his plan in each age. Each successive age brings out more of God's plan. At the end of each age, man fails and proves that he needs a savior. In each next age, God gives man more power, only for man to fail again. God proves that no matter how much more power man receives, it is never enough, so that man needs a savior. In each dispensation or age, there is some new level of accountability that man has as God reveals more of his plan to present his sovereignty and salvation. Now, I'm going to stop with that. I'm describing a definition of dispensations. On page 244, you can see, there it is right there. Too much glare on there. See, this dispensations summarize with man's responsibility, man's failure, God's judgment, and God's grace to provide the way through the next dispensation. The next time we'll go through the dispensations, we'll look at them, try to do a cursory look about them, and then we'll have some more to say. But that paragraph 684, is a real good summary of how a dispensation works. Okay, and as I said, the ultimate is God's vindication. When we get to the end of the millennium and Satan is loosed for a season to try to deceive the elect, it'll be one last time when God says, look, what more can I do than provide your salvation and rule and reign over you physically on the earth in the millennial kingdom, and yet you guys are still going to blow it. Therefore, God will have done everything. We'll launch into eternity at that point. Any questions? Yeah, Jesus said, apart from me, you can do nothing. Amen. Okay. She's trying to turn on the mic.
That, like the first one, like the Adamic dispensation. The second is the Noahic. Is that how that goes, or is that?
No, because there's an Adamic covenant and a Noahic covenant, and those are usually associated with covenant theology. So we're going to say innocence, conscience, government, promise, law, grace, and kingdom. And that's how we would look at it. Now, there's going to be some parallels there, like, for instance, with Noah, that's about the time that government is is instituted, because at that point that man is held accountable for the killing of man. And so that's the essence of what the ultimate authority of man could be. So that would be associated with government. But once you use words Noahic, Adamic, Abrahamic covenant, you're thinking, and that's theological language for talking about covenants usually. Somebody else, anything? Okay, well, very good. We've seen how liberalism got here, the charismatic movement got here. We're looking at dispensationalism and how its effect is going to be on us. We will look at the very dispensations and in the next time.